Okay, I think we've got this under control. So as Norma introduced me, I moved to this area, to Laconia, in 2017 after spending 3 years on my sailboat, traveling all up and down the East Coast with my husband and my dog. And once I got here, I'm retired and decided I need something to do. So I kind of fell into this cemetery hunting, and I would go walking out in the woods looking for old cemeteries, and then eventually stumbled into the job that I have now, which is business manager for Union and Bayside cemeteries. So when Norma asked me to do this, I decided I was going to throw in a little bit of genealogy, since after all, this is a genealogy group, but then I just wanted to sprinkle in maybe some interesting stories that, hopefully you'll find entertaining. So what can you learn from gravestones? Most genealogists have been searching for their ancestors' gravestones, or asking other people on Find a Grave to please take a picture because I can't get there in person. There's a lot of information that you can get on gravestones, like obviously the name, year of death, sometimes the whole date of death or place of death, age at death, which then can tell you what year they were born, the year of birth, date of birth, place of birth. Sometimes you're lucky and get a maiden name. And sometimes you see the relationship between parents and spouses and childs because that's actually written on the stone, or even other family members. And then often you can find occupation, religion, military record, or some other affiliation, like maybe they were in the Freemasons or something like that. And every now and then you also find cause of death written on the gravestone. So there's a lot of information that can help you as a genealogist. Oops. No. So for us in genealogy, we just wish we knew what city our immigrant ancestor came from. Wouldn't it be nice if that was on their gravestone in the United States? This is George Spencer. He was born in Hinckley, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Leicestershire, England. If anyone can help me pronounce that, that would be great. And his gravestone and those of his daughters and their husbands are in Bayside Cemetery, one of the cemeteries I manage. And as I was walking around learning the cemetery, and I saw this, and every one of them says they were born in Hinckley, Leicestershire, England, which I've never seen. And wouldn't it be great if we found our Irish ancestors' graves and that's what, they said that. So I started to do some genealogy on this family, and I found his obituary in the Laconia paper. And in the obituary, it says he's survived by a daughter in England, a son, George Spencer, who is currently in Sacramento, a Mrs. George F. Poor, a Mrs. George W. Lilly, and a Mrs. C.W. Levitt, and then several grandchildren. And so from the obituary, you would think that, well, there's the son, his daughter in England's not named, but the other 3 women are probably his daughters. However, buried in his lot next to him, we have Joseph Lilly, born in Hinckley, Leicestershire, England. Eliza, wife of Joseph Lilly, also born in Hinckley. And then we have William Garrett, born in Hinckley. And then we have Elizabeth, wife of William Garrett. And because these are all in the same family lot, I would imagine that these are George Spencer's daughters. But that's not the names listed in the obituary. We don't have an Eliza Lilly in the obituary. We have a Mrs. George W. Lilly. We don't have an Elizabeth Garrett. We have no Garretts. So this really puzzled me, and I had to get into it. And this brought me to the challenge in genealogy of multiple marriages. These lovely ladies here all married many times. In addition to that, their husbands each had married many times. So as I started to write the genealogy, each person's list became so long because of all the times they married. So there's George. He married a second time because his wife in England died, and that's why he and his son George emigrated to the United States. They came into Boston, and I think they lived for maybe a year or 2 in Ipswich and then moved up here because of the mills. You see, Hinckley in England is famous for its textile mills and making cotton stockings, which came to the perfect place to come to Laconia to do just that. And about 10 years later, his daughters came over. One of them came with their husband, another was a spinster and married here, and I forget about the other one, but his daughter Elizabeth, who is known as Betsy, she came over with her husband, William Garrett from Hinckley, but then he died and she married George Wood, and then he died and she married George Poor, so that's the name in the obituary. Same with Eliza Spencer. She married Joseph Lilly in England, came over, and he died, and she married Charles W. Levitt. I think she was Charles's fourth wife. And then Hannah Spencer also came over. She's buried in a different part of the cemetery with her last husband, George Lilly, who was the brother of Eliza's husband, Joseph Lilly. So you should see this genealogy. It's crazy. And the family tree is like a family web. So that's one of my favorite families in the cemetery, and I'm thinking about writing a manuscript on them. So remember I said in the beginning, sometimes you find out what the cause of death is. In Union Cemetery, there's a stone for Edward Davis, and right on the stone it says murdered, October 25th, 1850. So of course that intrigued me, and I had to find out all about it. And I went looking in the newspapers, and there's newspaper after newspaper with the headlines: terrible murder at Meredith Bridge, a man killed on account of jealousy, shocking murder. And I guess in 1850, murder wasn't very common, so a murder was big news. It turned out that Edward Davis was philandering with the wife of Rufus Flanders. And so immediately suspicion fell on Rufus Flanders as the killer of Edward Davis. Edward Davis was found drowned in the lake, and he'd been beaten, and it looked like maybe strangled or something like that. I mean, pretty obvious something bad happened to this poor man. And Rufus Flanders had been out of town for about a week before they found Edward Davis's body. But he was there when they found it, and he showed no guilt or remorse or anything like that. So all the townspeople were in a big uproar about all of this. Well, it turned out they went to trial, and it was like a hung jury. The coroner's inquest concluded that Edward Davis died by strangulation, bleeding, and drowning, but that the injuries were inflicted by Edward Davis himself, that it was suicide. Can you imagine? Who beats themselves up, strangles themselves, and drowns? I mean, so anyway, that's what happened. Rufus Flanders was questioned. He was arraigned, but he had an alibi. He was out of town for a week, so he couldn't have done it. Yeah. So I haven't seen too many stones that say murdered on there, but I imagine he was a young man. I imagine his family knew what happened, and they wanted to make sure that it was remembered forever that their son was murdered. Yeah, I can't. Yeah. Okay, this cemetery was kind of a fun one. I was looking for, I don't know how many of you know Warren Hughes, but I was looking for the Hughes Cemetery. I'm not sure if there's any relation to Warren Hughes for this cemetery, but I finally found it in Sanbornton. And while I did find a couple of Hughes stones, this stone for Jeremiah Ellsworth just intrigued me. I wanted to find out what his story was. So if any of you have looked at the history book, the Runnels History of Sanbornton, there's a whole section of tragic deaths in Sanbornton. And January 19th, 1810 was called the Cold Friday. And it was just a day where the temperature was mild, and then all of a sudden plummeted, and the wind was blowing. And I mean, just terrible, terrible day. So I'm going to read to you from the book about what happened to poor Jeremiah Ellsworth. The farmhouse of Jeremiah Ellsworth on the old New Hampton Road gave way to the violence of the gale. Half an hour before sunrise, the windows being blown in, exposing the whole building to destruction. Mrs. Ellsworth and her youngest child took refuge in the cellar. Mr. Ellsworth covered his two other children in bed and started for the neighbors, David Brown's, reaching there at sunrise. And even though it was only 100 yards away, his feet and face were badly frozen, and he was unable to stand. Mr. Brown hastened to the house with his horse and sleigh and found Mrs. Ellsworth and the children as left by the father, except that the wind had blown off the clothes from the oldest children. And he loaded mother and child into sleigh and covered them with some bedding and started for his own house, but his sleigh kept being overturned by violent gusts of wind. And he kept trying to urge the mother to just go, just get out and reach the house. I'll get the kids there. But she couldn't do it. Her limbs were beginning to fail. She had to crawl much of the way on her hands and knees. And he kept trying to get the children to stay in the carriage, and the carriage the sleigh kept falling over. And finally, he left one of them under a log, and he started towards the two oldest on foot towards his house, and they were frozen stiff. And all three children died, all three daughters. Other neighbors came to the rescue, and the body of the remaining child was soon returned. But Mr. Brown was blind the rest of his life in consequence of his exposure, and the children's parents suffered long and severely from their injuries. So this other stone here, there's Jeremiah Ellsworth's stone. I never did find his wife's stone, but his children are buried in unmarked graves up in Sanbornton, very near where they died. And I just thought that was a really tragic story. Not all the stories are tragic. Okay, so back in the 1800s, you will often see the words relict or consort on the grave of a woman. And relict means that the woman was a widow and had not remarried when she died. Consort means that her husband was still living when she died. Although the first time I saw consort, I kept thinking maybe they weren't married. Maybe they were shacking up or something. So there's a cemetery in Alton. It's actually right over the border from Guilford. And it has the stone, the one in the middle, that says Ruth P., wife of Daniel Flanders, and consort of Amasa K.J. Flanders, died January 10th, 1883. And of course, the first time I saw it, I didn't know what consort meant. I got to figure out what that means. Was, did her husband die, and then, or does she have two husbands, or what's going on? Well, her husband Daniel died in 1845. He was only 38 years old. And right now on the other side of her is a Massa K. Flanders stone. He died in 1882. So she did marry Daniel Flanders, and she was his widow when he died. And then she turned around and married Amasa K. Flanders, who was 20 years younger than her. But there's a caveat in Daniel Flanders' will that he left all of his real and personal estate to his wife, Ruth, during her remaining my widow. In other words, she can't remarry. With the estate to be split among his three daughters after she has passed on. So I don't know for sure. I mean, maybe the wedding to Amasa was just in name only. It was his father that married them. But I wonder if they were really married or if they just lived together, sort of pretending to be married so she could keep the estate. I'll never know. This was fun. I was on vacation in Nova Scotia and went to, I don't know how many of you have been in Nova Scotia, gone to Louisbourg, the big fort, all the way out on at one end of Nova Scotia. And I was looking through a cemetery, of course, even on vacation. And I found these two stones that both said that the men under the stones were killed at Marconi Towers. And because there were two of them that both said that it was the same date, I thought there must be a story behind this. This is in the Stella Marist Cemetery. So I looked up, of course, in the newspapers and found out what the Marconi Towers incident was. Well, first of all, the Marconi Towers were built on Nova Scotia to provide the first transatlantic communication by Marconi. And this was not the one where this incident happened, was not the first one, because the first towers were built in 1902 in Cape Breton. But on this day, this fateful day, these men were being assisted by workers. They were erecting a cage from like going up a steel mast and span about 110 feet from the ground. The mast was an extension of one of the towers. Suddenly the tower started to buckle at the 90-foot mark, causing the upper mast to tip, and the foremen fell to their deaths amidst the tangled girders. Workers on the ground escaped injury. So these are two of the men, and there were two others that also died, and I did not find their graves, but three of them were carried in a funeral procession from Glace Bay to Louisbourg, where they were all laid to rest in Stella Maris Cemetery. So sometimes when you see a stone, there's more information than what you might expect, especially if you dig a little bit deeper. I didn't mean that, but into research. Okay, I grew up on little shelter island in New York. It's at the very eastern end of Long Island. You have to take a ferry to get to it. And there is a Quaker cemetery. Nathaniel Sylvester was the first settler on Shelter Island. In fact, he owned the entire island. He was granted it in, I have that somewhere, 1651. Yeah. And there's a manor house there, and it's a beautiful ground. It's now an educational farm, but there's this kind of creepy Quaker cemetery. And when we were kids, we all would dare each other to go at night to see the lady in white, you know. It was one of those, you know, rites of passage, I think, when you were growing up there. And they still have Quaker meetings there, which is kind of cool. And in the middle of the cemetery, there's this huge table, marble slab table, a monument to Nathaniel Sylvester and to his family. But it was not erected until 1884. He died in 1680. And his great-great-granddaughter, something like that, decided that because Quakers don't have gravestones, they don't have, you know, any kind of headstones or anything like that. She thought that he was such an important person that he needed to be memorialized forever, even though he was a Quaker. So this is what's written on this tablet. And it's written on the top and it's written underneath. You have to go under and go underneath and read it. And the stairs are all carved. Yeah, under the table, literally laid down under the table to read some of it. Yeah. And it basically, can you imagine if you had this if your ancestor was documented this way? What a miracle. Basically talked about Nathaniel Sylvester, first proprietor of the manor on Shelter Island under grant, blah, 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 blah. The daughters of, these are the women who actually erected the tablet. And it gives all of their little genealogy and when they set up the stone. And then under the table, you have the entire descent from Anne Brindley through Thomas Brindley, King's Auditor, to Nathaniel Sylvester, who married Griselle Brindley. And it goes on and on for generations, all written underneath this table, which you can't see unless you're laying down underneath it. And then it gives all the succession of proprietors for Shelter Island. So it started with the Manhasset tribe, then the king, and all the way through. And then on the south steps, the north steps, or all around on the steps is documented Quakers who came to Shelter Island seeking refuge from persecution in Boston. Some of them stayed there, but they were all sheltered by Nathaniel Sylvester, and some of them did die there. And it's very hard to read the steps now. Thankfully, someone has taken a recording of this long ago. But look at these inscriptions. Daniel Gould, bound to the gun carriage and lashed. Edward Wharton, the much scourged. Christopher Holder, the mutilated. Humphrey Norton, the branded. John Rouse, the maimed. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in all of my cemetery travels to see this amount of detail. And I do know that Lawrence and Cassandra Southwick did escape Boston and came to Shelter Island and were sheltered, and they did die there. Some of the Quakers stayed and then returned and then were executed in Boston.
Isn't Mary Dyer the statue of her outside the Capitol?
Somewhere, yeah.
She was accused of being a witch.
Yeah, her name's familiar. And George Fox, of course, founded the Friends, the Society of Friends, or Quakers. And he stayed with Nathaniel Sylvester for a while. So that's just a little bit of history from my childhood. Okay, where are we now? Okay, so sometimes you find cemeteries or gravestones that have been erected long after the people have died because their graves are unmarked. This happens quite a bit in New Hampshire, I've seen. And in Jaffrey, there's a smallpox graveyard where 5 men and 1 girl died from smallpox in 1792. And it's on a farm, about a 10-minute walk through the woods. And during the smallpox epidemic in the 1790s, the victims were put in isolation while they were still alive, but these were separated from society after they died. They weren't allowed to be buried in the actual regular cemetery. They had to put them in a special place. And there were no gravestones, but through some research efforts from the farm owner and another person, they finally found who it was that died of smallpox at that time and was buried in that cemetery. And they had a marker erected to memorialize them so that they would not be forgotten. This one, I've not seen this in person. I don't know if any of you have. It's also in Jaffrey. This is the monument to Dorothy Caldwell, who was the wife of a sculptor, Viggo Brandt Eriksson, and her infant daughter. Dorothy lived from 1889 to 1926. Her daughter, unfortunately, died in childbirth, or died, very soon after childbirth. So Viggo and Dorothy met in Paris. She was from New Hampshire, but she was living abroad. And he was a Danish sculptor and had come to Paris to get into the art scene, to try to make his mark in the art scene. And they married and soon after had a child. But unfortunately, like I said, the newborn died and very soon followed by the mother. But before she died, she made her husband promise to bring her back to New Hampshire so she could be buried in the shadow of Mount Monadnock, which he did. In 1926, he carried his wife and daughter's urns to New Hampshire, where he'd never been, and then spent the next 2 years sculpting this mausoleum out of grief. He wanted to make it a perfect replica of his wife's face. Isn't that amazing? And it's huge. I mean, it looks huge to me. I've not seen it in person, but you can judge by the other gravestones to the back. This thing is probably 10 feet tall. Yeah, and then he stayed in New Hampshire for the next 20 some odd years as a sculptor. Did monuments like this, but also memorials like war memorials and that sort of thing. So if any of you are ever in Jaffrey, go check out the old bit. Yeah,
Right there.
go check out the old burying ground and Dorothy Caldwell's memorial. So this one has a bit of a funny story from my cemetery searches. I was on a farm out in Sanbornton looking at a cemetery and taking pictures for Find a Grave. And to get to the farm, I had to drive down the farm road and there was a big gully or ditch on one side. And so I parked off to the other side and looked at the cemetery, did my pictures, and I came back. And I was in my Toyota Avalon at the time, so I didn't have my trusty Subaru. And I was very uncomfortable backing up. I didn't have a rear view camera, and this road was super narrow. And if I went too far, I was going down in a gully. So I was a little nervous, and it's saying my internet connection is unstable. Oh. And so this bicycler came by, a man on a bicycle, just at the opportune time, and he helped guide me so I could back my car out. And then we got to talk, and he asked what I was doing. I told him about the cemetery. He goes, "Oh, I know a good cemetery for you to find." And he gave me such detailed instructions. You got to go down this road, and then you get on the range road, and then you're going to see the snowmobile path. And you walk up the snowmobile path, and you'll see the oldest cemetery in Sanbornton. So, of course, how could I resist? I had to go find the cemetery. So my husband and I and our dog went to find the cemetery, and find it we did. And you can barely see in the photo on the left, you can see a gravestone right in the back. I mean, it is very overgrown, and there's a cellar hole nearby, and it looks like it was probably his farm, where he actually lived, this person who had the cemetery. But it is just typical of New Hampshire old family cemeteries. And this one is of the family of Joseph Philbrook. And on one stone are the names of most of his family, all on the same stone, but it doesn't tell you how they're related. When you find ones like these, it's usually they were put up after the fact because the original stones are gone, and so someone, and unfortunately it doesn't always happen that they get replaced by something like this. But so I did some research on him. This was the only stone that I could really see well with the original stone. And sure enough, it was Joseph Philbrook, a simple farmer in Sanbornton, his wife Mary Fogg, their son and his wife and their daughters. So that would be Joseph's granddaughters. And then Joseph and Mary's daughter and her husband and their daughter, and even his second wife. And the whole family relationship is right there in the cemetery. I find these old family cemeteries to be some of the most invaluable for genealogists because, I mean, it's all right there and they have to be related. Okay, so this one was fun. Ebenezer and Sarah Smith were the first, Ebenezer Smith was the first settler of what is now Laconia. When he came, called it New Salem and then Meredith. But where it was in the part of Meredith that is now in Laconia. And the Laconia Historical and Museum Society and the New Hampshire Old Graveyard Association held a workshop to learn how to clean his stones, because we had done, Lynn Keltz, who's on the call right now, she had done this long program on the first settlers of Laconia and their histories. And of course, Ebenezer Smith was the star of the show. The story about him is he and five other men, he and Joshua Crockett and 5 other men came up from Exeter looking for new land. And they got to the top of Cotton Hill, and the vista that opened before them would have been, Lake Winnipesaukee and Paugus Bay and all of that. And they decided, this is where we're going to stay. 5 of the men turned back, but he and Joshua Crockett stayed and started to clear the land and develop the land and all that kind of stuff. And after a few years, he went back to get his wife in Exeter. And she brought his wife back on horseback with her holding their son, baby son, and he with a puppy in his pocket. And they both rode together on horseback from Exeter to Laconia. That's the story. That's whether it's true or not, I do not know. But we felt it was important to get these stones cleaned up. So yeah, we did. And it took all day. It took several of us, most of the day. Because, you can't pressure wash these kind of stones. But look at them now. Aren't they pretty? Yeah, you have to do a lot of scrubbing to get those lichens off and all that. But that was kind of a fun little project. And we're going to try to keep working on that cemetery. It's the oldest cemetery in Laconia. So at Bayside, we're lucky enough to have the Charles Busiel Mausoleum. Now, Charles Busiel was the first mayor of Laconia. He was also the governor of New Hampshire. But he had sort of a tragic life. Actually, I would say his wife had sort of a tragic life. The first thing that happened to him was his grandson died. And I'm going to switch back and forth here. His grandson, and I don't think he was very old. The headline for the paper said basically he evaded the governess at the riverbank in Amesbury, Massachusetts, and drowned. And another boy who tried to, saw the accident and swam to the rescue, he gave out too, and they both drowned. So that's the first bad thing that happened to poor Charles Busiel. Oops. Okay, so then Charles Busiel dies only 23 days later. And then his daughter died. He's the only child. He only had one child, Frances Busiel Smith, and she only had one child. She died in 1911. But she was married to a rather wealthy man, and she left a bequest to Bayside Cemetery, which her mother managed the bequest and her estate and all of that. And money was put into the cemetery to purchase a lot and to build this mausoleum. Now, Charles had been buried in a different part of the cemetery, probably in another family lot. Frances was buried in Pennsylvania, and I'm not sure where Frances's son was buried, but he obviously was buried somewhere else. But Eunice Busiel basically planned, she drew this out with her son-in-law, the plans for the whole thing, gave the money to the cemetery, had everything all worked out, and then also paid for the bodies to be transferred up to be put into this mausoleum. So it's quite an impressive mausoleum, actually. This is the inside. So they're each in drawers. The caskets are in these marble drawers, all engraved with their names. And in addition to that, they put money into a trust fund for the perpetual care of the cemetery. And the trust fund provided, your basic cleaning and flowers. And she had a caveat where flowers had to be put inside the tomb for Christmas, Easter, and each of their birthdays. And that was done, as my understanding, for years and years and years, that was done. And then somehow, as things turned over and changed, knowledge of this trust fund became lost to Union Cemetery. Nobody knew about it. And Suzanne Purley, who was the previous manager to me, she had started in 2009. She got contacted by a bank in 2015 about this rather sizable trust fund. And she had the whole, the trust documents and what it was supposed to be used for and all of that. And so Union Cemetery got a nice little happy present that they never even knew existed. And it was because somehow, the communication had just kind of stopped. And You know, the post office box may have changed, but the money, $2,000 to begin with, sat there for over 100 years. With,
Are you putting the flowers in?
yeah. We put flowers and we clean spring and fall because, you know, the mice and spiders and that kind of stuff get all in there. So we do clean it. But yeah, so it was kind of a nice little thing for Union Cemetery. Oh no, well, I have 3 employees, 3 groundskeepers who manage all of that kind of stuff. But they did let me go inside and take pictures, and it's kind of weird in that very close quarters. I mean, when you're standing, it's maybe, I don't know, 8 inches from my hips to the to the drawers. It's a little, and I know they're right there, right behind those drawers.
Are your trusts governed by the Attorney General's office the way, you know, trustees and trust funds?
No, because Union Cemetery is a private nonprofit.
Right.
And so is Bayside Cemetery. So Laconia does not have any like cemeteries that they actually run that are active. They just take care of the old ones. Yeah, we have 2 Catholic cemeteries that are run by the church, and then we have Union and Bayside, and that's it. And all the other cemeteries are managed by, they're not active anymore. They're the old cemeteries, and Parks and Rec in Laconia takes care of them. But the city of Laconia does manage our perpetual care trust fund that started when the cemetery was first open and people would pay in there 20 cents a month or 50 cents a month. And eventually all that money goes into perpetual care. Speaking of perpetual care, people ask me this all the time, but you know, can you imagine in Bayside, we have over 6,000 graves, and in Union, maybe 11,000. Can you imagine if we had to keep track of who paid for perpetual care and who didn't? Because that's what they did when they first started. The groundskeeper only took care of the lots where someone paid perpetual care. If you didn't pay in, you weren't getting taken care of. But obviously, we don't do that anymore. Everybody gets taken care of equally. Okay, so when we were sailing and we would come through New Hampshire, my husband and I always stayed at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard with our boat. And as I was walking through, they have a cemetery there, and it's mostly for unknown sailors. Most of the markers are unknown sailors, but there's a few others. And then just outside of that is their animal cemetery. I don't know if any of you knew this. So there's a horse buried at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. His name's Old Tom, and he's the only horse to be buried there. He served with the U.S. Marines in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. And if any of you seen the old Spanish prison at the naval base there? Oh, it is creepy. I mean, I've seen it in person, but I've also sailed by it. It is the creepiest place you've ever seen. Anyway, Old Tom retired, but he lived to the ripe old age of 41 years old. Can you imagine? And then there's 2 bulldogs. Both of them were mascots for the U.S. Marine Corps. One was named for Lieutenant General Louis Testy B. Puller, Semper Fidelis, a faithful friend. He was a 4-year-old dog. And the other bulldog served with dignity and honor, a true devil dog and friend. And his name was Corporal H.G. Spike. So it's a cute little cemetery. Okay, this one is interesting. Well, they're all interesting. Okay. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Josie Langmaid murder. This monument is in Suncook. On October 4th, 1875, in the town of Pembroke, 17-year-old Josie Langmaid went missing. She didn't show up for school. Search parties were organized, and within 24 hours, she was found in 2 pieces. Someone had attacked and abused her on her way to school and severed her head from her body. About a week later, a woodcutter named Joseph LePage was arrested, tried, and found guilty of murder, and he was hanged on March 15th, 1878 in Concord. So Josie was buried where this little stone is on the left in the Langmaid lot in Buck Street Cemetery. That was not good enough for the townspeople. So they erected this monument near where her body was found, right across the street from the school. So the kids who walked to and from school walk by this every day, and there's a marker like one of those granite posts in the ground near where her head was found and where her body was found. That's your gruesome Halloween story there. Sorry. I had to throw something like that in. Okay, this is another cemetery, and this is down in Portsmouth. And I was intrigued because it says on the first grave here, it says, I asked who was Robert T. Nicol. It's written in Latin. Of course, I had to go translate Latin. So what it says, here lies Robert Thomas Nicol, sinner, whose soul Jesus will forgive. Of course, I had to find out what's that about. So
Sounds like it announced.
I know. So the cemetery is called the Whiteside-Cary family lot, and it's at Sagamore Creek, which back in the 1880s was an art colony. A lot of wealthy summer people and art, and then artists and sculptors and musicians, architects, but the wealthy people were kind of their benefactors. Well, and this was the summer estate of Arthur Astor Cary and his wife, who was Agnes Laura Mary Whiteside-Cary. And Arthur had studied art in Paris. He became a trustee of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, supporter of art societies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this was kind of their thing. And they were quite wealthy. He was a descendant of Jacob Astor. He was born in Italy. And I think that's why maybe the stones are in Latin. But there's two other stones there, one for Agnes Mary, Laura Mary Whiteside-Cary, blah, blah, blah. And then another one for Prisciliano Fuentes Mexicanos. So Prisciliano was their servant, and he was buried in the same cemetery with Agnes. Agnes died in 1932 and requested to be buried there. Arthur Astor Cary's ashes were just spread on the farm, but then there's this mysterious Robert T. Nicol, sinner. I had to find out something. So I looked, and I found Agnes Cary's will. So she wrote it in 1929. Her husband had already died, leaving a $2.8 million estate, which back then was a lot of money. It's still a lot of money today. And provisions for her burial and a memorial, all the memorials to be done. $2,000 to Prisciliano in appreciation of his faithful service, and then a yearly income to be paid to two men, Charles Mills of Dedham and Robert T. Nicol of New York City, New York. Aren't you already wondering what was going on with those two? So Robert T. Nicol lived on Washington Square, 61 Washington Square in New York City, and he was an art assistant at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Still don't know what the connection was, but it definitely makes me wonder, why would she let him be buried in her family cemetery? And why does his stone say sinner? And why did she leave him a bunch of money? I don't know. Okay, this one I've actually given whole presentations on just this cemetery. Belknap County Farm Cemetery is in Laconia. It's Poor Farm Cemetery. And there are 42 plain headstones like you see here with names and dates of death. And then there are 60 with just numbers on them. And I was shown this by a friend of mine, and he said, maybe we can find out who's buried here. Well, Belknap County has no records. Laconia has no records. So I had to dig. I wanted to find out who these people were. Now, in each of the county reports, the physician gave a report of who died at the farm that year. And then in the city reports for Laconia, they also give accounts of who died, and then some information that may be known about them, like who their spouse was or who their parents were, that sort of thing. And so I had to go through all these reports starting from 1873 up till the farm no longer existed and had become the county nursing home. And then search for their death records on Ancestry, but not everyone who died at the farm is buried there. Only the ones whose families didn't claim them, or who had no family, or who were very, very poor. That was kind of like the place of last resort. But through all that effort, I was able to find 58 names out of 60, and 4 children, which I think the children were probably buried in the special section. So yeah, it was, like I said, I could spend a whole presentation on just this because I talk all about the thing, but if you try hard enough, like persistence pays off. And now the cool thing is that one of the descendants of one of the people buried contacted me, verified his ancestors' burial, and had a plaque made with the name on it. So I wish everybody would do that. Oh yeah, so earlier this is a Bayside cemetery. And earlier this year, a woman contacted me regarding a gravestone that was in her barn in Laconia. And it read, Herbert, son of J.S. and C.J. Crane, died August 20th, 1865, aged 2 years. And she was wondering if I knew where this boy was buried. Like, was he buried at Bayside? So I looked into my records, and for the Crane lot, this is the Crane lot here, and there are no names on the Crane headstone at all except for Crane. And on the other side is Tetley. And so first I went to Bayside Records, and in my records I have John S. Crane and Clara J., his wife, are buried in the lot. And then John S. Crane, baby, with the same date as Herbert. And then Mozilla Crane, who is also John S. Crane's son and Clara J. Crane's son. And then his daughter, Winifred Tetley and Guy Tetley. So that's who's buried in the lot. And I said, you know, the date match on this little gravestone to what I have just as John S. Crane baby, which just means it was a baby of John S. Crane, and they didn't know, you know, what the name was, has to be the same person. So then I talked to the woman a lot more, and it turned out this is the home of John S. Crane, and that is where she now lives. Her mother bought this home from Guy Tetley from the estate of Guy Tetley after he died. And that stone was there when they bought it in, say, 1933, 1934. And they always wondered where it belongs. Well, it belongs at Bayside Cemetery, where he's buried and where his parents are. It's not there yet. She's going to wait till spring to bring it up, but she's going to have it put on the lot.
So the baby had a name.
Yes, he had a name. He wasn't just baby. We have a lot of those, infant son of, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, and little lambs and that sort of thing. So I think I've told some of you this story. But the last one. So we have a Laconia connection to Meghan Markle. I didn't know if any of you knew that. I assume you know who Meghan Markle is, Duchess of Sussex, married to Prince Harry. And our connection is through Merrill Fay, owner of Fay's Boatyard and the Merrill Fay Ice Arena, that Merrill Fay. And he is on the board of directors for Bayside Cemetery. So I went through the genealogy, which her genealogy is already done pretty much. I mean, you can find the royal stuff anywhere. Her father, his grandparent or his parents, Doris R. Sanders, Gordon Arnold Markle. Doris is buried there, but she doesn't have a gravestone. And then her parents, Gertrude M. Merrill and Fred Sanders. And then her parents, George Merrill and Mary Bird. And Merrill Fay is second cousin, once removed, to royalty. So of course we tease him about it all of the time. But the story on this goes that Meghan's great grandmother, who would have been the generation before this Mary Bird, was the daughter of Thomas Bird and an Irish shoemaker and his wife. And it would be this Mary Bird. Thomas served in the British Army and they were stationed in Malta. They stayed for 20 years. Mary Bird was born there. But eventually they migrated to Canada and then settled in Meredith, where Mary Bird met and married George Merrill. And then we have this little connection. So Doris Sanders, this would be Meghan's grandmother. She doesn't have a stone. She's in an unmarked grave. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to send Meghan an email and say, you want to come to Laconia and get a stone for your grandmother? But I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to leave you with this. Hopefully you'll be making copies or making it available. Okay, I think we're done. Yes, thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay,